and welcome to Democracy in Action, the show where we talk issues affecting you and your community. I'm Helga Janssen-Daubia. Following months of campaigning, South Africa has drawn the curtain on a robust elections 2019 season. The ANC retains its majority, albeit at a drop in electoral support, while the DA has seen a marginal reduction in support, leading the party to not only lose seats in Parliament, but also see its core support base unravel. The DA's loss, however, seems to be the Freedom Plus's gain, while the DeLille DA battle has resulted in Auntie Pat gaining votes and seats. One of the bigger winners in this election, however, was the economic freedom fighters, having grown its share of the electorate to just over 10%. Losers of the day, Black First, Land First and COPE must go back to the drawing board and reflect deeply on their election strategy. While there's been no fundamental shift in electoral patterns, the electorate are sending signals to parties. Exploiting race and class may not be the go-to move in the next election. But what does all this mean for our democracy? And what would be the outcome of a government under construction? Tashreeq Truebody explores this question in tonight's episode of Democracy in Action. But before we go to Tashreeq, let's hear what South Africans had to say about elections 2019.
We are proud once again to meet this mandate. And by declaring the national and provincial elections 2019 to be free and fair, and to announce the results of those elections within the 3 days that we finished polling. The Free Front Plus with 10 seats, Inkatha Freedom Party with 14 seats, and the Economic Freedom Fighters with 44 seats. The official opposition in the 6th Parliament will be the Democratic Alliance with 84 seats. And finally, distinguished guests and fellow South Africans, for the 6th time in 26th year in a row, the majority party in the National Assembly of South Africa will be the African National Congress with 230 seats.
This election confirms that freedom and democracy does indeed reign in South Africa. And we are grateful for that. It gives us the assurance that our people are indeed the true custodians of our freedom and democracy. We pay tribute to the millions of our people who went to the polls to choose the public representatives who will champion their collective interests and aspirations. We can declare with certainty that democracy has emerged victorious in our country. Our people have given all the leaders of this country a firm mandate to build a better South Africa for all.
Welcome to Democracy in Action, the expression of which we saw on May the 8th. It's been an interesting election. It has come, it has gone, and now political parties are seized with formulating either a government or send their representatives to Parliament. We take a look in this edition of Democracy in Action this evening at just what the elections meant for South Africans, what the outcomes mean for South Africa, and how to go about formulating governments that will be held accountable. Joining me for this conversation is Lawson Naidoo. He's the Executive Secretary for the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Also with us this evening is Sanusha Naidoo, a political analyst. Thank you so very much for having joined us here, and a very good evening.
Good evening, thank you.
I'd like to start off with you, Sanusha, just your assessment of the elections so far. I mean, it's come, it's ended, and now political parties this week are seized with trying to formulate either their governments and their political representatives. But from just a cursory look at the outcome, what would you say is the take-home message?
I think there are quite a few takeaways from this election, particularly in terms of voter turnout. I think voter turnout was low, even lower than the 2014, and that in itself is an important message to take away in terms of trying to figure out and trying to understand why did voter turnout come out at 17.6 million people, which just shaved under, I think, 66% of voter turnout. And that does have an impact on the elections, on the election outcome, election results. And it also tells us, for example, when you start to then look at the actual percentages and the votes, and not the votes, the seats in parliament, who were the winners, who kind of lost, who kind of made gains, etc. I think for this election you have parties like the Freedom Front Plus, which found a resurgence. Perhaps they're very kind of conservative, kind of extreme of the spectrum in terms of the right, appeal to particular voters in terms of the land question, the land issue in particular. And then of course you have a party like the IFP in KZN, doing really well. It's not a region that they haven't done well previously in the inner part of northern KwaZulu-Natal, but they've really come out in terms of both their national footprint, winning 4 more seats, and of course at the provincial level. And then of course there were questions about I think if we were all betting people and Hollywood Bets had anything going on here in terms of whether the polls were getting it right, in terms of the way in which they allocated, they predicted the outcome. I think the AFF will probably feel very, very chaffed because of the fact that they've got double digits. But again, I think that the challenge in all of this is what do we take away? So voter turnout, but also not underestimating the mindset of the electorate. I think in the Western Cape it was quite interesting to see the split vote. People were splitting their vote. I mean, it's a very kind of it's a mandate or it's an expression of interest, but there's also a lot of important dynamics about what the messaging was from the electorate to political parties in terms of the DA, in terms of the ANC.
And I'd like to pick up on that with you, Lawson. What does that mean, the message? Because I've seen some of the analysis post the election that seems to suggest that Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of the ANC, has saved the party, that it's because of his leadership and what he represents. He perhaps took the party from their predicted 40% to their 57% or so that they did receive. Is our political system, though, rooted in that sort of approach, that we're electing a president while technically we're electing a party that selects amongst itself whom it wishes to represent in a government?
Well, look, I think, Cyril Ramaphosa has been a huge electoral asset for the ANC. They would certainly not have done as well as they did without him at the helm. That much is clear. And, I think one has to accept that, and I think the ANC needs to accept that. And what he's done is effectively to turn around the downward trajectory of ANC support over a number of elections. From 2009 onwards, the ANC has been decreasing its support on an almost continuous basis, and we saw it most explicitly in the local government elections in 2016, when it dropped to 54% of the national vote. And so basically what the ANC have been able to achieve in this election, which is no small feat, is to actually reverse that trend and to begin to grow again, albeit marginally. But I think from an ANC perspective, they will be hoping that this marks the start of a new era of support for the ANC. But having said that, coming back to the issue of voter turnout, and yes, we talk about 66%, but less than half of eligible voters actually voted. We have 9 million people who weren't even registered. to vote. So you've got an eligible voting population of over 36 million. And just over 17 million voted.
And do you think
that I think is a strong message.
Is that an apathy issue, or is that just, democracy under threat? What did you attribute this to?
I don't think it's an apathy issue per se, because I think South Africans are very vested in our future, in our democracy, and in the direction of this country. I think what we're seeing is a lack of trust, a trust deficit between political parties and the electorate. And I think that's across the board. It's not just an ANC problem. It's a problem for all political parties. And in particular, I don't think political parties have been getting their message out to the young people of South Africa. They're not addressing their concerns in a way that is meaningful and with a message that lands. So young people are opting out of the political system. It's not that they don't have a voice and they don't express themselves, because we see on a daily basis that they do. They just do it in different ways. And I think this is something that political parties are going to have to deal with in the next few years, is how do we get those young people back? How do we get their voices heard properly so that we can address the concerns? I mean, for a country that's sitting with a youth unemployment problem of over 50%, I think that, in a sense, that may explain why so many young people feel left out of the system, that the system doesn't work for them. And we've got to fix that.
And notwithstanding that very real threat around young people just not participating, Sanusha, I'd like to pick up on the type of support that we did see generate for parties like the African National Congress. It still having tipped over 10 million votes from those that did participate. It's a party that still enjoys, majority support.
I think if you want to basically take that argument to 94, 99, I think there was a strong traction. I think this time around, I think the ANC was also very worried because a 9.9 million versus a 10 million is also a psychological barrier as well.
Yes.
So they just tipped the 10 million mark. So I think they were quite chuffed that they did that. But the thing here is that this demographic profile of the country is changing rapidly. And the point that Lawson was making about just less than half of the adult voting population voted. I mean, it's under 38 million. And if the population is increasing, and if you're not capturing the imagination, you're not being innovative, you're not messaging and creating traction, then the challenge for you is that you shouldn't be comfortable with 57 either. You shouldn't be comfortable with 10 million. You shouldn't be comfortable with anything that tells you that you're not basically moving with the times, with the trend in terms of the demographic profile. But that's just not an ANC problem. It's across the board, even for the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance has to be very careful in assuming that its support base is static. It's not. It's changing. You've got demographic growth in different contexts of the province. You've got demographic growth amongst the different racial groups in the country, and so perhaps there's something to be said, is that as there's one section of a conservative element, and it's not a massive element, but it's definitely one that's there, moved out of the DA into the Freedom Front Plus. Now, does this give the DA a little bit more flexibility and strategic maneuverability to say, how do I get into that footprint in terms of getting the black youth into my party? Can I be imaginative? Can I get them in? The challenge for political parties is they need to start thinking about the changing demographic profile, the growth, population growth. If we're adding about, say, 5 million people, I don't know how, over a year or 18 months to 2 years to the population, that means that we should, voter turnout, and according to the numbers, if we have to calculate it, was 48% and not 66.
Well, it's an interesting statistic, which I think is important to try and formulate just, what the will of the people means. And perhaps to pick up there, Lawson, how, sort of just a practical approach here to understanding our politics. Is the sort of results and the trends that we've seen, does it give us a sign of a maturing democracy or more so? And I think Sanusha alluded to how you can't take into consideration 94, 99. What we're beginning to see potentially are more structured political patterns in terms of support and even just how affluent these things can become.
I think what we've seen in this election is a very fluid electorate.
Yeah.
And I think that it's demonstrated by the polls that were so wrong. because of their methodology and because they didn't allocate undecided voters appropriately. And that's why we had this vast spectrum of, some polls showing the ANC just getting over 50% and others saying they would get beyond 60%. And it's because there was a huge chunk of undecided voters. And, as Sanusha has mentioned, many of those voters voted tactically. They voted one way at national level and a different way provincially. And you see that in the breakdowns. I think one of the big issues for the ANC in particular is that they lost support in every single province. In all 9 provinces, they lost support. And and that poses a long-term problem for the ANC, because whilst they comfortably held on to the northern provinces, Limpopo and so on, Northwest and Mpumalanga, their level of support amongst the black African electorate is falling. And it's being taken away by the EFF largely. But that's a long-term trend that should be of major concern to the ANC. And I think what this election is about is really, this is the last chance for the ANC. I think the voters have said, we're going to give you one more opportunity, basically because there isn't a credible alternative in our politics, regrettably. And I think the ANC have now been put on terms by the electorate to say, you now need to deliver. We've heard your messages, Mr. President. You're talking about fighting corruption, state capture, reducing the size of government, creating a more effective and efficient government. And people want to see that. And I think the time for rhetoric is now long gone. People's patience is wearing thin.
Sanusha, let's talk Western Cape. Has the DA also been put on terms, having lost some support?
No, I think it has. I think the DA has been, from 59 point, just over 59% to just over 55%. Yeah, they may say we still got 24 seats. We didn't lose. We only lost 2 seats, but 2 seats is 2 seats. For the DA in the Western Cape, I don't think that they are growing in the way that they wanted to grow. I think that they're kind of constrained by the spatial optics and the way this province is organized, both physically, infrastructurally wise, and just in the terms of how they deal with the province. So I think one of the bigger challenges for the DA is the message also that, yeah, we'd like you to be in the province, but we're not necessarily ready for you to be a government in waiting for 2024. I think for the DA as well, the message for them is, you got to worry about the fact is, have you been innovative enough in your election campaign? I think in places like Gauteng and stuff with the Isidimeni, those posters, etc. For me, it goes back to the 99 period where the DA used the fight back kind of election messaging. They just got it horribly wrong now. That's not what the electorate is looking for. Perhaps for a party like the Freedom Front Plus, slaan terug makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But in the case of the DA, you need to start evolving. So I think the challenge for the DA as well is how connected they are in those wards that they won, in those areas that they won. How connected are they with the electorate? With the people in those wards with regard to the kinds of issues they should be taking. The problem I think the DA is having, as much as they criticize the ANC, is that they also try and voting in particular ways as a block party, in terms of the representatives are now in different wards, in different areas. They are voting as a block party. So if there's a message to the ANC that, you know what, we put you on notice, I think the DA also has to deal with some of these issues. It cannot be business as usual. Yes, we got the Western Cape. We got a local government election coming in as well. So I think in some of the wards that I've seen, not just in the Western Cape, but in Johannesburg as well, where the DA didn't return in those wards.
Let's use an example, Bukap. Bukap saw a
Exactly.
massive shift in political support.
Yeah.
And that community in particular has been dealing with issues around water bills, property rates, electricity that's been skyrocketing, gentrification. Do these wards signal potentially what is looming for the DA in a local government election?
Well, I think if they don't necessarily think about how they align their issues. I think this election is also about realignment for a lot of political parties and the way they conduct their politics and the way they conduct their kind of positioning, their engagement with the electorate, with their support base. And I think this is the same for the DA. So I think what's going to happen for them is, if they're not necessarily taking into account, if the ward council or the ward council, etc., also works on the basis that, I must vote for what the party says in the city, as opposed to what the ward is asking us and what their grievances, issues are, and I don't take those into consideration, I think we're going to see a very wild 2021 local government election.
How much of that, Lawson, should worry political parties at this time? I mean, I hear some of them are already looking forward to the municipal election. Do you think that, both for the DA and the ANC had given the somewhat rise of smaller political parties that it's a really fair game in a local government election, and that really we could see even political patterns shift even further?
I think, as I said, we've got a very fluid electorate at the moment, and I think that's not going to change. I think political parties will make a mistake if they simply focus on the local government elections in 2021. I think what people of South Africa are saying, we want to see action, we want to see delivery. And I think, if political parties don't deliver that, then we're going to see, a reduction in voter turnout again, and people turning their backs on parties. So I think that's the first thing, and it applies to all the political parties, and how effective you're going to be in opposition. And I think one of the big problems that the DA faced in this election was that it was trying to be all things to all people, and its message wasn't, consistent. It was delivering mixed messages, mixed signals to the electorate, and they failed to adhere to the cardinal principle of politics, which is to look after your core support base, and they didn't do that adequately.
But what is that core base? I mean, that's the. I listen to the type of reaction that we've seen, to whether Musi should be held accountable for the essential loss in support, or the fact that they haven't really grown in this election. But what is that core base? Is it a white minority core base?
Well, it is that, but I think there are a number of core bases that they have. So it's the white electorate by and large, and we saw them lose some of that as to the Freedom Front Plus, but also the coloured electorate here in the Western Cape. And they shifted their focus in this election away from the Western Cape to Gauteng. Put a lot of resources into trying to get the ANC below 50%, and I think they failed to look after the Western Cape, and we've seen that in the reduction in support here. So for the DA, it's a particularly poor election outcome. Not only did they lose 2 points nationally, on the basis that this was the best opportunity for them after 9 years of Zuma misrule. They were not able to capitalize on that, and that's going to surely be a severe setback for them. And they may end up trying to use Musi Maimane as the scapegoat, but it's not purely his responsibility. It was the party as a whole not being consistent enough, not addressing the key issues in South African politics. Is about transformation and growing the economy in an inclusive way. They fudge those issues. Their policy on transformation, on affirmative action, doesn't endear them to the electorate, and they've got to grapple with those hard decisions if they're going to become a serious player that is going to attract black electoral support.
Yeah. In fact, as a serious follower of news, I myself can't pinpoint exactly what their position is on transformation. They have a diversity clause, but what that means, many South Africans don't really know.
It's open to interpretation. Different people within the DA interpret that diversity clause in very, very different ways. So that they're not on message.
Yeah. Well, this is the question that the DA now faces. In fact, the conundrum that they face as they try and assess just how they performed in the elections. We all know how they performed, but the type of money and the resources that were put in, some very serious questions need to be asked of the Democratic Alliance, and in fact, they're doing so at this very time. We're going to go for a break. Once we return, we look at the rise of smaller political parties. Is Anti-Pat here to stay? How good is good? And we also take a look at the Freedom Front Plus, which, as we discussed, has had a great showing at the polls, some of which has seen their core base being re-energized. We'll get into that and more shortly after this. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Democracy in Action. We're talking elections, the outcomes, and the formulation of a new government, a government under construction, both at a national and a provincial level. Joining me for this conversation is Sanusha Naidoo. She is a political analyst, also the Executive Secretary for the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, CASAC's Lawson Naidoo. Let's quickly take a look at these smaller guys that have contested elections. And 48 political parties, that's a lot of money to put up, lots of betting to see if you're going to be able to convince the electorate. I feel very sorry for some of these guys that lost quite a bit of money. But, it's been, for me, a very polarizing election in that there were so many options to choose from, so many different issues to have to contend with. But we saw certainly in the outcome of this election, Sanusha, the rise of Patricia de Lille's Good political party, which I don't think was that much of a surprise. We knew that she will have a showing at the polls, but to what extent we now see about a 4% political party. And the increase in support that the Freedom Front Plus did get. Let's start with Auntie Pat. What does her electoral performance vote mean, not just for her, but for Western Cape politics?
I think generally the tagline could be that she's a survivor. I think that the thing about it is that she was able to utilize that complete breakdown and incoherence with the DA, and she decided, okay, I'm going to have a political party. One of the things I find very disturbing about smaller political parties that come onto the scene in the way that even Patricia de Lille's party came on is that they do really well in their initial showing, or in this case, well, not for the others, the other 27 who had problems. But not in her case, she had a support base. I suspect that it was a traditional ID base that went back to her in certain ways. People who felt that, as Lawson was saying earlier about the DA, is not being in touch. Not communicating, actually, being very disconnected in terms of how some of the issues and some of the internal dynamics of the party and polarization and contestation would affect its branding, its imaging, etc. So I think she kind of capitalized on that a little bit. I think also what's important as well is where is she going? She got two seats at the national level, one seat in the province. Now, is she better at national or should she be in the province? Given that she's had this major spat with the party, she came out fighting and always claiming them to prove the kinds of questions of integrity around her person and so forth. So does she stay in the national? Does she go to national, which is very likely, or should she be in the province where she could probably fight some of those and challenge and probably that base that voted for the ID, I mean the good party here in the province felt that perhaps they could have a more vibrant, a more kind of critical voice. But that's what concerns me as well about political parties, is that I want to see how she does in the next election, which is the local government election. Maybe the traction will be better. But for example, she spent a week in the Northern Cape. It didn't really go in her favor. So there's going to be those questions for me in terms of some of the fluidity that Lawson is referring to about the electorate and how that also applies to the smaller political parties. Just to say that we have a syndrome in South Africa where smaller political parties burst into the scene and then the effervescent fizzles out. Now we've got other political parties that I just want to go talk to where if you look at the, as you said, Freedom Front Plus, did really well. I think but one weird calculation I saw was just looking at representation in Parliament says they got 125% in terms of representation and boosting their presence in the National Assembly. But I think again that we also start to ask ourselves is, are we entering fringe politics a little bit? Because there was two interesting things that came out for me as well, is that the EFF went on a very radical approach to land issue and the Freedom Front Plus was on the other extreme. Yeah. And that kind of tells you some of the issues and how that correlated with the mindset and the messaging for the political party, for the electorate. So I think it's interesting for Freedom Front Plus. What I also found interesting for Freedom Front Plus in the province was when you looked at province to national. When you looked at province to national, you saw the Freedom Front Plus do better than Patricia de Lille. And I think that's a signal as well as to where the electorate wanted to see these political party leaders to be. So lots of people in the province thought it was better for the Freedom Front Plus to be at the national, whereas they felt Patricia de Lille should be in the province. Yeah.
Well, interesting observation. I mean, either that or, Peter Marais was the...
Oh, no. Let's not even go there. I think the man has just... I think he was very interesting, but I did also see that the Freedom Front Plus was like looking at him and thinking, we need to keep him in check.
They looked equally nervous. Lawson, what your take on the Freedom Front Plus? I mean, does Sanusha have a point here? And what I also spoke about the polarization of our politics, that it's heading one extreme to the next.
Well, it is. I mean, and I think there's what the election demonstrates is that there are people who are concerned about the land issue, and I think this is a big challenge for the government now. Is forget the rhetoric and the robust debates we've had in the last 2 years around land. The government's got to actually deal with the issue of land reform and land redistribution. And how it does that, whether a constitutional amendment is necessary or not, I think we've got to move beyond that now and say we actually need to fix this. And I think the electorate in different ways have made that point. So, the Freedom Front Plus, opposing expropriation without compensation, it was a message that landed with some of their supporters, and I think that's why we've seen that growth, because some people want to see a firm stance on that. On the other end of the spectrum, we see the EFF offering land and jobs. Many people would say that the EFF's model for land reform is highly unrealistic, and we've got to find a solution somewhere in the middle, which I think is where we're heading as a country. But I think the importance of issues means that people have really focused their minds in terms of how they use their vote this time. And we've got a very discerning electorate in South Africa, which I think we sometimes forget. And I think blind party loyalty is a thing of the past. And people are going to be measured now on what they actually do.
Yeah, and I just want to hone in with you very quickly on the significance of what this entire discussion has been underscored in quite a bit, is the role in how people voted provincially and nationally as well. Is there a lot of focus on provincial government? I mean, in government circles, there's lots of conversation, at least from a national level at the moment, around what's the relevance of a provincial government, other than looking nice and sometimes passing laws here and there.
Yeah.
But how much of the electorate's wishes on the provincial ballot is of relevance to their own governance?
Well, it is relevant, but and it's it's an expression of how people feel about how things are happening at a perhaps more local level. But as we know, that the real delivery happens at a local government level, not at provincial government level. The powers of provinces are quite limited in terms of the constitution. So it's a tier of government that I'm not sure that we really can afford in South Africa. And nobody wants to have that discussion about whether we do away with provinces or not. But I think at some point that debate is going to have to happen, because
we have to have a job for Supra. Come on.
well, exactly, and this is but this is exactly how we ended up with this three-tier system of government. Was because of the compromise in the constitutional negotiations in the 90s. It's about it really is about patronage, and it remains that to this day.
Yeah.
And I think it suits all political parties to keep that system in place.
Yeah. Sanusha?
Yeah, just on that point, I think Lawson makes a valid point, because we've always been arguing, what's this tier system? And if you got this middle layer, which essentially is duplication of resources, I mean, just look at the amount of money that these provinces are essentially absorbing in an unproductive way. But look at some of the protests as well. People who are saying, I want to actually not be in this municipality. I want to go to another municipality. Could have been on the border with another province. So you kind of also getting the sense of, are these provinces in particular regions actually delivering on their services? So this is the other issue as well. Vuane, I love Vuane in terms of how in 2016 they decided to host a football match instead of going to vote. This time around they opened the thing, but they said, people can decide if they want to go vote. So I think what the other messaging from this is the fact that people are actually saying, you know what, these guys are sitting in the middle layer, they're not doing much, duplication of resources, perhaps it's a debate we need to return to.
It absolutely should. And let's quickly have a look then at moving forward, right? So now there was an election. The expression of the will of the people is there. That's a lot of what we've been talking about. Political parties are now seized with selection of who's going to parliament. Now, those lists already have been submitted. What do those lists represent? And, just a very basic understanding, Lawson, of how these lists are formulated.
Well, the parties are required to submit lists ahead of the election to the Electoral Commission. They supply a national list, a list of candidates for election to the National Assembly, and then they also submit regional lists from each party in each of the provinces. Submit regional lists for election to the National Assembly, as well as a provincial list for election to the provincial legislature as well. And it's on those lists have been submitted, and they can't be changed at the moment. Take the ANC as an example. They've been allocated 230 seats in the National Assembly.
So we get the first list of 230 names.
Well, 115 will come from the national list, from the national list, and the other 115 will come from the provincial list or the regional list. But so perhaps just to explain how the allocation of seats is calculated. So the system that we use in South Africa is a pure proportional representation system where every single vote counts. So what happens is all the votes go into one big pool, and then you, whatever the total is, 17 million and whatever, and then you divide that by 400.
Okay.
It's on that basis, and then half from the national list and half from the provincial list according to the party's support. And that's how the composition of the National Assembly is determined. Is using that. So 200 from the various parties' national lists, and the other 200 from the provinces, and that is not split equally. So a province such as Gauteng, which has got the biggest population in the country, will have more representatives from their regional list to Parliament than, say, for example, the Northern Cape with a very small population. So it's weighted in that way, and that's how the other 200 are allocated. And the benefit of that system is that it gives broad geographic representation in the National Assembly. So political parties won't just choose candidates from the major urban areas only, and they're forced to allocate parliamentarians from across the country. So we have a real National Assembly with representation from all corners of our country.
And Sanusha, those lists, what do we read from the politics of this list? I mean, I've seen in the lead up to the election how there was a strong criticism here for the ANC that still maintained the names of Nomvula Mokenyane and others, on that list, Batabile, Dlamini. But it's a difficult job for even the president of the ANC or any political party for that matter, where there are very influential figures in that party that may be reflected on those lists. What do we read the politics from that list?
Yeah, I think the challenge here is where do your allies lie on the list? So I think in the case of the run-up to the election and the fact that these lists had to go forward, there was also internal politics around how these lists were composed and who was involved in composing these lists. So I think the challenge right now with regard to who goes to Parliament and who will probably not go to Parliament based on these lists is essentially how the internal discussion will happen in the party. For a president like Ramaphosa, I think he needs to look at it and think, okay, who's in the top 20? How much of that is going to be in favor of me and what I want to get done in terms of policy certainty, or how much of this is going to go against me? I think some of the allies, as Lawson and I were talking earlier, is at the bottom of the list, so they may just fall off. SACP, for example, some of them will not. There's talk that SACP ministers currently may not make the cut and may not become in the cabinet, go into the cabinet. So I think there's a whole lot of different dynamics that now emerge post the election. And in terms of political parties sitting down internally, right now the ANC is having their National Executive Council meeting, and I think questions of who's going to be premier, questions of the lists are going to be big discussions, and these are going to be internal dynamics that are going to influence this nomination of people to the National Assembly, and in terms of who becomes part of the provincial executive and the provincial structure in terms of both for the ANC.
Yeah. Well, so after the lists have now been submitted, there is the swearing in of MPs, right? After those final selections are made, and we all know now who's going to either provincial parliament or even to the National Assembly. Those MPs are now lawmakers, and from there a government is chosen and the president is elected. Just talk us through that process, because even while there is, of course, the broad assumption that Ramaphosa is the next president of the country, he still has to be elected by members of parliament. Talk us through that process.
Okay, so what happens from now is that the first sitting of the National Assembly will take place on the 22nd of May. And at that meeting, which will be presided over by the Chief Justice, or a nominee of the Chief Justice. So at the moment, Parliament has been dissolved.
Yes.
So the Chief Justice takes over the proceedings at that first sitting, at which the first order of business is that all MPs are then sworn in, take the oath of office in front of the Chief Justice. They then elect a Speaker and a Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, and then proceed to elect the President of South Africa. And it's quite clear that the ANC candidate will be Cyril Ramaphosa. We've seen in once or twice before opposition parties putting up an alternative candidate and forcing it to a vote. Probably unlikely to happen this time. but we'll see. The president is then elected by parliament, and in a strange quirk of our constitutional system, the minute the president is elected as president, he ceases to be a member of the National Assembly.
Yes.
So an extra seat gets filled from the ANC list to replace him as a member of the National Assembly. Within 5 days after his election, the president then needs to be inaugurated, and we already know that the inauguration will take place on Saturday, the 25th of May, at Loftus Versfeld in Pretoria for the first time, not at the Union Buildings, but at Loftus.
That's the first time I hear that.
The president is then inaugurated, and then he formally takes office. And his first order of business, once he's been inaugurated, is to appoint his cabinet.
Yeah.
And that we expect to see perhaps on the 26th or the 27th of May, that the announcement of that cabinet, which will, I think...
And that cabinet is formed from the members of parliament?
It's formed from the members of parliament, of the National Assembly, and the NCOP if he chooses. But he also has the ability to choose 2 people who are not from parliament to be appointed as members of cabinet. And he may choose to exercise that discretion, given what we've been discussing already, that many of his allies are very low on the list. So one example, the current Minister of Trade and Industry, Rob Davies, is not on the ANC list at all. Not only is, not even low down. He didn't make it at all. So it's possible that President Cyril Ramaphosa will say, well, I need to keep Mr. Davies here, and I'll use one of my 2 from outside of Parliament to keep him in cabinet. So, or he may, choose to appoint 2 other people from outside of Parliament.
Yeah. And how does he go about formulating that cabinet, Sanusha? Keeping in mind that there are calls for the streamlining of this cabinet, there's a large public opinion that it's far too bloated, but there's also this tricky thing about ANC politics, trying to appease every faction in the party. Is it an easy job, to go about formulating this cabinet?
No, I don't think he has the easiest task in the world in terms of the kind of cabinet he would like to have, technically, but the kind of cabinet he has to basically compromise around. And I think that's the big challenge for him. How much of the internal dynamics of the party will influence what he can do and what his flexibility is will be very critical. I think the NEC meeting that's taking place will be critical to that as well, in terms of how these different dynamics play out. But what I found very interesting in the election is, as the election was happening, the results were being announced, was that the markets didn't get too nervous. And I think that's a good signal in terms of, although Moody's, the credit rating agency, did come out over the weekend and said he will be constrained in terms of policy reform and so forth. But I think the markets didn't get nervous. The rand didn't, start becoming completely volatile. And that's a good message for now. But I think we're still not out of the woods yet in terms of what will be the cabinet he puts together, and whether Mr. Rob Davies comes in, or who he puts in terms of the economic cluster, or try to cluster particular ministries in a way that enables the ministries to work in a more effective and in a more connected way with each other. But I think he has to deal with something that the predecessor left as a legacy, and this bloated cabinet. And whether or not this will have impact on the fact that when you start to talk streamline, you have to also bear in mind you're talking about job losses in terms of a public sector. And I don't know how the unions will react to that in terms of the PSA and other public sector unions, but I think it's going to be a challenge. And whether or not the ANC, as you kind of picked up in the optics in the room at the Results Operations Center, in terms of some of the stuff that was happening and how the body language and the responses is going to play out, I think it's going to be a very difficult place for him to be, and he'll need as much allies as he can. And whether he's managed to create some sway in the NAC as a result of the fact that you heard murmurings that it was important. He didn't say it openly. I mean, he can't say it. But what was interesting yesterday outside Luthuli House was his body language, and that we are going to Pretoria, and you gave us the mandate. It was the ANC. So he has to keep the collective. And that collective remains there. So it's going to be interesting, but I think that it's not going to be an overnight decide, I'm streamlining this cabinet and that's it.
Yeah.
It's going to be a very, what you call this, it's going to be a process. And it's going to have to take place, I think, in phases, is the way I see it. I don't know.
I disagree with you on that one. For the reason that I think Cyril Ramaphosa is now at his strongest, the strongest he's ever going to be as president of the ANC. He's in a strong position right now, and he needs to act. He's made lots of promises that people, you know, of the qualities of people that he will want in his cabinet.
But does
And I
he
think he's
have the
got to
necessary energy to act? Does he have the political strength to do so?
Well, that's the big question. You know, as I say, in my view, he should have. He should feel that he has that strength now. He's got a, you know, the ANC has done better than they feared. So he ought to be stronger and, you know, and to deal decisively with these issues. Because I think if we see this sort of phased approach again, you know, people are going to get very despondent and say, you know, it's more of the same. You know, there's no policy coherence. It's, you know, one step forward, two steps backwards. I think people are tired of that.
I think that's the one thing, well, some people appreciated about Jacob Zuma. He wanted to act, and so he did.
Yeah.
Whether he did so appropriately is debatable.
Yeah, but you know, I think you know, and you know, the markets are going to look at the composition of that the size of the cabinet firstly, as you said, but also the composition and what message does it send out, certainly in the key portfolios, the economic cluster. You know, what message are we sending out to the international investor community to say that we're ready for business?
I think you're right. I think if it went over to about a 60% over, it was him. So he has that gravitas, that ability to say, you know, this is me, mandate. 57% is not a bad mandate either.
No, it's not.
It's not. But how does he deal with people like Batabili? How does he deal with Nomvulo? How does he deal with Malusi, Gigaba? How does he deal with Ace?
Yeah, well, I think, you know,
Ace is, that's the big
I
one.
think the two most difficult ones are Batabile and Namvula. I think the others, you know, Malusi is quite easy. You know, he resigned from cabinet last year. I don't think he's going to come back anytime soon. But you know, and the message of unity that the president is talking about now, in the wake of this election, to say the ANC has won this election, we must pull together. There's a job of work to be done.
Yeah.
And I think it's you know, we've heard this term unity before the NASREC conference, which it meant a whole different thing back then to Didi Mabuza and his supporters.
It reminds me of our sausages made. It's not a good process. Just very quickly, we're running out of time, but I quickly want to talk about the role then of those MPs, those lawmakers, other than sitting in committees and the formulation of, you know, policies and laws of government and of the land. What's Parliament's role and their role in keeping government to account?
Well, I think that's a critical question, and you know, I've used this phrase that we need to press the reset button now. We can't continue like we have done over the last few years, and institutions within our democracy need to come up and step forward and play their proper role that is envisaged under the Constitution. The reason we had state capture is because Parliament failed to do its job. It failed to exercise oversight of the President and over the Executive. And Parliament needs to you know, to reassert its authority now and to hold Parliament and to hold government and the President to account. You know, other institutions within our democracy need to do their jobs properly. SARS, the NPA, the Hawks, the Chapter 9 institutions. Each of those have a key role to play, and I think what we want to see now is each of those institutions doing exactly what the Constitution requires them to do.
Yeah. Sanusha, in 30 seconds, the way forward, politically, are we sound? Are we getting somewhere?
I mean, I think that what Lawson said is critical in going forward. But I think the other thing that's also important is that people are saying, we also trust candidates, we trust people. We didn't vote for the ANC, we voted for Ramaphosa, but it was about his ability. So I think that there's an interesting dynamic about also revising or re-examining our electoral landscape. And of course, it'll be interesting to see what the independent candidates do in terms of that court case in the Constitution. But again, you know, the challenge right now is you need to basically, you can't sit on your laurels anymore. You've got 230 members in the National Assembly. You can't sleep anymore in Parliament. You can't basically not come to debates. You can't necessarily just leave it. So the whips are going to be, the ANC whip office is going to be important. But it's also going to be the fact that people will be watching you on everything because they need to be there on different on policy issues, on lawmaking, on accountability, on oversight. So it's going to be not as easy as before.
Not business as usual, says Sanusha Naidoo and Lawson Naidoo. Thank you so very much for having come through. Lawson is from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Sanusha Naidoo, political analyst in studio. As we talk post-elections, what the process is in the selection and the appointment of lawmakers, the appointment of a cabinet, and the politics that come with it. I trust that, we view this as a social compact or a contract that we've now signed, with political parties, and despite lawmakers, we're expecting a parliament to hold government to account. We have another 5 years to go, to see what exactly they're going to be doing. A fluid electorate is what we are being told you are, but, keeping government to account, there are certain and very many mechanisms to do so. I trust that you enjoyed this conversation of Democracy in Action. Until we talk once again, you have a good evening, and thank you so very much for tuning in.
The electorate votes for the political parties they choose to represent them in Parliament. Voters give their representatives the responsibility of making decisions on their behalf. When members of Parliament take their oath of office, they solemnly affirm to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa and to obey, respect, and uphold the Constitution and all other law of the Republic, and solemnly promise to perform their functions as members of Parliament to the best of their ability. The Constitution protects our democracy by separating the power of the state into 3 arms of state, namely the legislature, Parliament, the executive, cabinet, and the judiciary, the courts. The 3 arms ensure that power is divided so that no arm of state has all the power. This minimizes the risk of abuse of state power. Each of these arms has its own special responsibilities, but functions in a way that complements each other so that effective and cooperative governance is possible.
To find out more about Parliament, go online to parliament.gov.za.